My daughter came home from her SAT tutoring session with her face flushed and hands shaking, barely able to speak through her stutter. When I snuck back to watch through the window, I saw the prestigious tutor everyone in our neighborhood raved about standing behind her with his hands on her chest, whispering about private lessons and how smart girls keep secrets. After I recorded him and called 911, my military connections revealed he'd done this to 17 other girls across 3 states, but that's when his real campaign of terror against my family began. I still remember the day my daughter came home from her SAT prep session with her face completely flushed and her hands shaking. She'd been getting straight A's ever since we hired Mr. Blackwood, the miracle tutor everyone in our neighborhood raved about, but something about her demeanor that day made my stomach drop. I asked her what was going on, keeping my voice steady and calm. She couldn't get the words out. My daughter had always been shy, but this was different. Her stuttering was lasting longer than usual, which made me immediately suspicious. After 10 minutes, she finally said enough for me to make out what was going on. Well, kinda. I knew it was something about Mr. Blackwood and feeling uncomfortable. It was enough for me to be filled with rage. In front of her, I kept my cool and used my usual dad trick. I grabbed a piece of paper, scribbled a world's bravest daughter certificate onto it, and handed it to her. Through her tears, she started giggling and finished her evening with a Disney movie marathon. The next day, after I dropped her off, I waited in the car park. After 20 minutes had passed, I sneaked back to the house and stood outside the window of his study. I honestly had no idea what I was doing or what exactly I was looking for. I just knew I needed to do something, and after just a few minutes, I got my answer. Through the blinds, I could see my daughter sitting rigidly in her chair while Mr. Blackwood stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. A feeling of unease filled my veins, but that was soon replaced with rage. "You're so tense, Sophie. You need to relax if you want to understand calculus," he said, his hands moving lower. She tried to shift away, but he gripped tighter. "Mr. Blackwood, She struggled to get the words out, her voice trembling, but instead of backing off, he leaned closer. Suddenly, his hand moved to her chest. "Your heart is racing. Are you nervous about something?" he whispered, mockingly. It took everything in me not to burst right through the window and start throwing hands, because I knew I needed evidence. So instead, I started recording with my phone. His hands kept wandering as he murmured about private lessons and special attention and how smart girls know how to keep secrets. That's when my cover was blown, because my daughter suddenly stood up and tried to make a beeline towards the door, but he grabbed her wrist and she let out a whimper. I immediately kicked in the door and she ran into my arms. I held her so tight she could barely breathe, and I immediately felt her little shoulders loosen up. I put her down and she tightly held my hand as I called 911. When the police arrived, they looked skeptical at first, until I showed them the video. They cuffed him while he screamed about lawsuits and his reputation. But instead of relief, the detective just sighed. "Another one of these," he muttered. My hand that wasn't holding my daughter's tightened so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I was about to say something, but that's when I noticed the awards on Blackwood's wall. Yale, Harvard, Princeton. Acceptance letters from his students dating back years. That fact was enough for me to realize how deep this went, because I began to understand the pattern. You see, I worked as a general at a military base. My clearance gave me access to databases most people didn't know existed. None of the parents knew this, because it usually garners a lot of attention, something I wanted to avoid. But I was about to use every connection I had. I let my daughter stay home from school while I investigated. Fast forward to Friday. We were due at the police station for her formal statement, and she was begging me to let her drop it. "No, sweetie pie, you gotta stop him from hurting others," I'd tell her. I knew she was going to be questioned, doubted, made to relive it, but I wanted justice. In fact, the more evidence we gave them, the better. So when she had just finished her first sentence, and the detective said, "Are you sure you didn't misunderstand?" I smiled, because that's when 6 military vehicles pulled up outside, and JAG officers began to fill the station. Everyone sat there frozen, not knowing if this was a raid. As my daughter locked eyes with me, I told her to continue. She kept talking, but this time, the room was silent, except for Blackwood's lawyer, who couldn't help but smirk. In response, one of my officers placed a thick folder on the desk, files on 17 other girls across 3 states. As soon as my daughter finished, they took over the case as a federal matter. Everyone's heads turned to look at each other, and the station was flooded with controlled chaos. Some officers were even saluting. Meanwhile, Blackwood looked like he was about to tear the room apart with fear. This made me even more satisfied, and a sense of justice filled my stomach. I thought the story had ended, but really, it was just beginning, because it turns out that Blackwood had an ace up his sleeve, one that threatened to destroy not just my career, but my family's safety forever. The next morning brought an ominous silence. No phone calls, no messages, just the quiet before a storm I knew was coming. Sophie stayed home from school again, curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket while I worked from my home office. Every few minutes I'd peek out to check on her, watching as she slowly worked through her homework. The bruises on her wrist had faded to yellow, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. 3 days after the arrest, the first sign of trouble arrived. A certified letter, delivered by a nervous postal worker who practically ran back to his truck. I opened it in the kitchen, away from Sophie's view. It was from Blackwood's new lawyer, some hotshot from the city. The letter outlined their intention to sue for defamation, false imprisonment, and violation of privacy for recording without consent. Inserting myself in here because I've never seen anyone solve for X by getting their shoulders rubbed, and then Dad goes full spy mode standing outside the window like he's in some action movie, but forgot to bring snacks for the stakeout. I bet he was thinking, should I burst in now or wait for more evidence, while probably getting leg cramps from crouching behind those bushes. They claimed the video was inadmissible, and that my military intimidation tactics had violated his civil rights. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. Let them try. But that was just the opening move. move. The next day, Sophie's school called. The principal explained that they'd received a formal complaint about my aggressive behavior and military connections being used to threaten a respected member of the educational community. They suggested it might be best if Sophie took some time off until things settled down. I hung up without responding. That afternoon, while Sophie napped, I noticed a car parked across the street. Same silver sedan that had been there yesterday. The driver never got out, just sat there watching our house. When I stepped onto the porch, the car slowly pulled away. By evening, our doorbell camera caught someone leaving flyers on our neighbors' doors. I retrieved one after dark. It was a professionally printed newsletter about false accusations ruining good teachers' lives, with Blackwood's photo and a sob story about his charitable work. Sophie found one that had blown into our yard the next morning. Her face went pale as she read it, and she handed it to me with shaking hands. I burned it in the sink while she watched, then made her favorite chocolate chip pancakes to distract her. The psychological warfare escalated quickly. Our mail started arriving, opened and resealed. Strange numbers called at all hours, hanging up when we answered. Sophie's social media accounts, which I monitored carefully, began receiving friend requests from newly created profiles with no pictures. I documented everything, creating a file that grew thicker by the day. But I knew Blackwood was smart. Nothing could be traced directly back to him. A week after his arrest, we learned he'd made bail. Some education foundation had posted the money, citing his decades of service to young minds. The news hit Sophie hard. She spent the rest of the day in her room, refusing to eat. That night, I installed new locks and a security system. As I worked, I noticed fresh scratches on the back door, like someone had tried to pick the lock. The security company tech mentioned seeing similar marks at another house last month, right before a break-in. The restraining order we'd filed was approved, but paper doesn't stop predators. Blackwood was required to stay 500 feet away from us, but I knew he'd find ways around it. He did. Sophie's best friend Emma called one afternoon, confused. She'd run into Mr. Blackwood at the library, and he'd asked about Sophie. How was she doing? Was she keeping up with her studies? He'd seemed so concerned, so genuine. Emma's mom had been there too, and Blackwood had charmed her completely, talking about how worried he was about Sophie's academic future. The genius of it made my skin crawl. He was rebuilding his reputation while isolating us. Our neighbors started avoiding eye contact. The woman next door, who used to bring us cookies, now hurried inside when she saw us. The man across the street stopped waving. One by one, Blackwood was turning our community against us. Sophie noticed. She stopped wanting to go outside, even to the backyard. Her stutter returned with a vengeance, and she jumped at every unexpected sound. The confident girl who'd been acing her classes retreated into a shell of anxiety. I took leave from work to be home with her. My commanding officer understood, but I could tell he was concerned about the situation affecting my performance. The military values stability, and my life was anything but stable. 2 weeks after the arrest, things took a darker turn. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of our car alarm. Racing outside, I found all 4 tires slashed. The security cameras showed a figure in dark clothing and a mask, impossible to identify. The police took a report, but said without clear identification, there was nothing they could do. The officer suggested maybe I had enemies from my military work. Maybe this wasn't related to Blackwood at all. I knew better. The next day, Sophie's transcript request for early college admission was mysteriously delayed. The school claimed computer problems, but I recognized the pattern. Blackwood still had connections throughout the education system. Then came the letters to my commanding officer. Anonymous tips about my mental instability and vigilante behavior. Questions about whether someone who would attack a civilian educator should have access to classified information. The base security office opened an investigation. Standard procedure for any allegations. I found myself fighting a war on multiple fronts. Exactly what Blackwood wanted. Divide and conquer. A classic strategy. Sophie struggled with remote learning, falling behind without proper instruction. The tutors I contacted all seemed to have full schedules or didn't return calls. One finally admitted she'd heard about the situation and didn't want to get involved. 3 weeks after the arrest, I caught Blackwood's first direct violation. Our doorbell camera recorded him driving slowly past our house at 2 a.m., technically within the restraining order distance, but clearly surveilling us. I added it to my growing file of evidence. The next morning, Sophie found a note tucked under her bedroom window. Just 4 words. Smart girls keep secrets. She handed it to me with trembling fingers, and I saw something shift in her eyes. The fear was still there, but underneath it, a spark of anger. My little girl was starting to fight back. I called the police again. They took the note for evidence, but warned me about the lack of fingerprints or identifying marks. The detective suggested we consider moving, starting fresh somewhere else. Running wasn't an option. This was our home. That evening, while making dinner, I noticed Sophie at the kitchen table with her laptop. She was typing intently, her face set with determination. When I asked what she was working on, she showed me a document titled Everything I Remember. She was writing it all down. Every inappropriate comment, every unwanted touch, every moment of fear. Her hands shook as she typed, but she didn't stop. My brave girl was building her own case. The harassment continued. Takeout orders we didn't place arrived at our door. Magazine subscriptions we didn't want filled our mailbox. Our internet service was mysteriously disconnected, then reconnected days later with no explanation. But something else was happening too. Sophie started talking to her therapist about testifying. She practiced her statement in the mirror, working through her stutter with determination. She was transforming from victim to survivor before my eyes. 1 month after the arrest, we received word that the federal case was moving forward despite Blackwood's legal maneuvering. The prosecutor called to discuss Sophie's testimony, and I watched her sit up straighter, speak clearer. That night, as I tucked her in, she grabbed my hand. Her words came out strong and steady, no trace of a stutter. Dad, I want to stop him. Not just for me, but for all the other girls. I kissed kissed her forehead, proud beyond words. Blackwood thought he was breaking us down, but he was actually forging us into something stronger. The war wasn't over. If anything, Blackwood's desperation would only increase as the trial approached. But sitting there in Sophie's room, surrounded by her stuffed animals and academic awards, I knew we'd survive this. We had something Blackwood didn't understand, the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter. He could slash our tires, turn our neighbors against us, and threaten our future, but he couldn't touch that. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more harassment, more legal threats, more attempts to break our spirit. But tonight, Sophie slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and I stood guard over her dreams. The real battle was just beginning. The morning after Sophie's declaration brought an unexpected development. I found her in the kitchen at dawn, already dressed and making breakfast. She'd set out 2 plates, scrambled eggs steaming on each one. Her hands moved with purpose. No trembling, no hesitation. When she noticed me watching from the doorway, she simply nodded toward the coffee pot she'd already prepared. We ate in companionable silence, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She'd made a decision, and nothing would shake her from it. After clearing the dishes, she pulled out a notebook and began sketching a timeline of events. Each date, each incident, mapped out with military precision. My daughter was becoming a strategist. The doorbell interrupted our planning session. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as a social worker, responding to concerns about Sophie's welfare. Someone had reported that I was keeping her isolated from school, possibly against her will. The complaint suggested signs of parental abuse. I invited her in, keeping my movements calm and measured. Sophie sat beside me on the couch, her spine straight, her breathing steady. The social worker asked probing questions about our home life, Sophie's absence from school, the nature of our relationship. Sophie answered each query with clarity and confidence, explaining the situation without stuttering once. The social worker took notes, her expression gradually shifting from suspicion to understanding. Before leaving, she pulled me aside near the door. She'd seen this pattern before, she explained. False reports designed to harass and intimidate. She promised to note the suspicious nature of the complaint in her report. As her car pulled away, I noticed the silver sedan parked 3 houses down, still watching, always watching. That afternoon, Sophie suggested we visit the grocery store. She needed normalcy, she explained, even if just for an hour. I agreed, though every instinct screamed caution. We drove a circuitous route, doubling back twice to ensure we weren't followed. The silver sedan stayed away, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us. Inside the store, Sophie pushed the cart while I stayed alert for threats. We were examining produce when I heard a familiar voice behind us. Blackwood's lawyer stood there, coincidentally shopping for vegetables. He made pleasant small talk about the weather, the quality of the tomatoes, never mentioning the case. But his presence was message enough. They could find us anywhere. Sophie's hand found mine, squeezing once before she continued selecting apples. She didn't flee, didn't cower. Instead, she moved deliberately through our shopping list while the lawyer shadowed us through several aisles. When we finally reached checkout, he was gone, but the damage was done. The safe mundanity of grocery shopping had been violated. Back home, I found a package on our doorstep with no return address. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a SAT prep book, the same edition Sophie had been using during her sessions with Blackwood. Tucked inside the front cover was a photo of Sophie entering our house, taken from across the street. The message was clear. We're watching. We can get close anytime. I added the book and photo to my evidence file, now thick enough to fill a banker's box. Sophie watched me document everything, then surprised me by pulling out her phone. She'd been taking her own photos, she explained. Screenshots of the fake social media profiles, pictures of the silver sedan from her bedroom window, even a video of Blackwood's lawyer at the grocery store. My daughter had learned to fight back with documentation. 2 days later, our internet service cut out again. The service company claimed no outages in our area, but they couldn't explain the disruption. When the technician arrived, he found evidence of tampering with the external cable box. Ha! Nothing says I'm totally innocent, like having your lawyer accidentally bump into people at the grocery store while examining tomatoes, because that's completely normal behavior for a lawyer, right? Someone had been systematically disconnecting and reconnecting our service, just enough to disrupt Sophie's online tutoring sessions. Without internet, Sophie couldn't attend her virtual classes. I drove to the library so she could use their computers, but Blackwood was already there. He sat at a table near the entrance, legal textbook open, pencil in hand. The restraining order meant he couldn't approach us, but nothing prevented him from being in a public space we needed to access. Sophie froze in the doorway, her breath catching. I guided her back to the car, my hand gentle on her shoulder. She shook with frustration more than fear. Every avenue for her education was being systematically blocked. In the car, she pounded the dashboard once, then composed herself. We drove to the next town's library instead, adding 40 minutes to our journey, but finding a Blackwood-free environment. The pattern continued for days. Wherever we went, obstacles appeared. The pharmacy couldn't fill Sophie's anxiety medication due to insurance issues that mysteriously resolved after hours on the phone. The therapist's office had a scheduling mix-up that canceled 2 appointments. Even the post office claimed our mail was being held for unclear reasons. Through it all, Sophie documented everything. Her notebook grew thick with observations, timestamps, patterns. She approached the situation like a research project, finding strength in systematic analysis. I watched her transform from victim to investigator, her confidence building with each piece of evidence collected. One evening, while reviewing security footage, I noticed something odd. The silver sedan hadn't appeared for 3 days. Instead, different cars parked in the same spot, drivers changing but the watching continuing. Blackwood had recruited help or hired it. The surveillance was becoming more sophisticated. Sophie noticed it too. She'd started cataloging license plates, noting patterns in the watchers' schedules. They changed shifts at predictable times, she observed. observed. There were gaps in their coverage during shift changes. My daughter was learning to think tactically, finding weaknesses in their system. The next morning brought a new challenge. My commanding officer called me into his office. The anonymous complaints had escalated. Someone was feeding detailed information about my work schedule, my access levels, my recent emotional state. The allegations painted a picture of an unstable officer using military resources for personal vendettas. An official investigation was being opened. I sat across from him, maintaining military bearing while my world tilted. He expressed personal support, but explained that protocol demanded a thorough investigation. My security clearance would be temporarily suspended pending the outcome. Without that clearance, my effectiveness at work plummeted. Another front in Blackwood's war. Returning home, I found Sophie in the backyard, practicing her testimony to an audience of garden gnomes. She'd arranged them in rows like a courtroom, addressing each ceramic face with steady determination. Her stutter had completely vanished when she spoke about what happened. The truth, it seemed, gave her power over her own voice. That night, we ordered pizza from our usual place. When it arrived, the delivery driver handed over the box with an odd expression. Inside, instead of our regular order, we found a single slice arranged in the center, written in sauce on the empty cardboard. "Smart girls stay quiet." The restaurant, when called, insisted they'd sent our correct order. The driver, they said, was new, hired just that week. Sophie photographed the message before I could stop her. She was building her own case file now, parallel to mine. Her determination had evolved from mere survival to active resistance. She uploaded the images to a cloud storage account, creating backups of backups. Blackwood had taught her to be thorough, and she was using those lessons against him. The harassment escalated in subtle ways. Our garbage cans were repeatedly knocked over, spilling trash across our driveway. The doorbell rang at odd hours with no one there when we checked. Sophie's bicycle tires went flat overnight, small punctures that looked accidental but weren't. Each incident was too minor for police intervention, but collectively created an atmosphere of siege. Sophie responded by installing her own cameras using her birthday money. Small, wireless devices she ordered online and placed strategically around our property. She taught herself about angles and lighting, creating overlapping fields of view. When I expressed concern about her obsession with surveillance, she simply replied that knowledge was power, and she refused to be powerless again. 3 weeks into our siege, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma's mother called, voice hesitant but determined. She'd been thinking about Blackwood's questions at the library, she said. Something felt wrong about how interested he was in Sophie's situation. She'd done some asking around and discovered 2 other families who'd abruptly stopped using his tutoring services in previous years. Both had daughters. Both had moved away shortly after. I took down the names she provided, thanking her for her courage in calling. Sophie listened from the doorway, her eyes bright with validation. We weren't alone. There were others. The pattern she'd suspected was real. That evening, she started researching the families online, finding traces of their stories in school newsletters and social media posts from years past. The silver sedan returned the next day, but Sophie barely glanced at it. She was focused on her research, connecting dots between Blackwood's past students. Her notebook evolved into a complex web of connections, dates, and patterns. She'd found her power not in hiding, but in investigating, turning her trauma into determination. Honestly, those little ceramic guys are probably better listeners than half the people in an actual courtroom. Plus, they never interrupt or ask confusing questions, so that's already a win right there. My suspension from classified work continued, but I used the time to support Sophie's efforts. We worked side by side at the kitchen table, building a comprehensive timeline of Blackwood's career. Each prestigious acceptance letter on his wall represented a student, and Sophie was determined to find them all. Some had social media profiles showing successful college careers. Others had disappeared from online existence entirely. The intimidation tactics grew desperate. Dead flowers appeared on our doorstep. Sophie's favorite coffee shop suddenly couldn't remember her usual order, staff claiming they'd never seen her before. The local tutoring center received an anonymous tip about my unstable behavior and suggested I might be dangerous. Each attack felt like a probe, testing our defenses, looking for weakness. Sophie responded by widening her support network. She reached out to her old teachers, explaining her situation with calm clarity. Most expressed shock about Blackwood, but a few admitted they'd had concerns. One teacher remembered another student years ago who'd suddenly dropped advanced classes after tutoring with him. The stories accumulated like evidence in a cold case file. One morning, I woke to find Sophie already at her computer, video chatting with someone. She'd found one of the families that had moved away. The daughter, now in college, was willing to talk. I watched Sophie conduct the interview with professional composure, asking careful questions, taking detailed notes. The girl's story echoed Sophie's own, but she'd never reported it. Her family had chosen to run instead. After the call, Sophie sat quietly for a long moment. Then she opened a new document and began typing. She was writing a comprehensive report, she explained, documenting not just her own experience, but the pattern of behavior spanning years. If the legal system failed, she'd make sure the truth existed somewhere. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with purpose. The silver sedan was joined by a blue SUV the following week. Our watchers were multiplying, but Sophie had developed her own network of observers. She'd enlisted neighbors who'd remained friendly, asking them to note unusual vehicles or suspicious activity. Mrs. Chen, from 2 houses down, started taking her daily walks past our house at strategic times. Mr. Rodriguez across the street adjusted his security cameras to cover more of our property line. Blackwood made another calculated move, appearing at the school board meeting where Sophie's extended absence was being discussed. He sat in the public section, taking notes, his presence a silent threat. I attended with Sophie's principal, who'd become a fierce advocate for her. Blackwood's lawyer sat beside him, both both men radiating false concern for Sophie's education. During public comment, several parents spoke about the importance of maintaining educational standards. Their words seemed scripted, hitting talking points about attendance and the dangers of setting precedents. Sophie watched the live stream from home, identifying two of the speakers as parents of current Blackwood students. He was mobilizing his network against us. Sophie's response was to accelerate her documentation project. She created a website, password protected, and backed up across multiple servers. Every incident, every pattern, every connection was cataloged with academic rigor. She'd learned to channel her fear into methodical action. The site became her statement, more powerful than any testimony she might give. The investigation into my conduct at work dragged on. Anonymous tips continued to arrive, each more elaborate than the last. Someone had submitted a psychological profile suggesting I suffered from paranoid delusions. Another claimed I'd been seen stalking Blackwood's neighborhood. The lies were obvious, but still required formal refutation. Each response took time and energy away from protecting Sophie. Sophie noticed the toll it was taking. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch and pulled out a photo album. Together, we looked through pictures from happier times. Her first day of school, family vacations, birthday parties. She reminded me that we'd survived challenges before, though none quite like this. Her strength became my anchor. The breakthrough came from Sophie's meticulous research. She'd found a pattern in Blackwood's selection of victims. All were high-achieving girls from military families. All had parents deployed or frequently absent. All were isolated from extended family support. He'd been hunting in specific waters, choosing prey he thought couldn't fight back effectively. Armed with this pattern, Sophie reached out to more families. The responses trickled in slowly. Some ignored her messages. Others responded with caution. But a few opened up, sharing stories that had been buried for years. Sophie compiled everything into her growing database, building a case that no single victim could have constructed alone. Blackwood's campaign intensified as the trial date approached. The harassment became more personal. Sophie's childhood photos appeared on anonymous websites. Her academic records were leaked online. Private medical information surfaced in comments on local news stories about the case. Each violation cut deep, but Sophie refused to break. Instead, she learned about cybersecurity, implementing new protections for our digital lives. She taught me about VPNs and encrypted messaging. Our kitchen table became a command center, laptops and phones secured against intrusion. Sophie had transformed our defense from reactive to proactive, anticipating attacks before they materialized. The silver sedan disappeared one day, replaced by random cars that lingered too long. The surveillance had gone mobile, harder to track, but also less organized. Sophie noted the change in her files, suggesting Blackwood was running out of resources or reliable help. His network was showing cracks. My work investigation finally concluded with a formal reprimand for misuse of resources, though no serious violations were found. The damage to my reputation was real, but manageable. My security clearance was reinstated with conditions. I could return to full duties, but any further incidents would result in immediate termination. Blackwood had wounded us, but hadn't achieved the unalive shot he'd hoped for. Sophie celebrated by cooking dinner, the elaborate meal she'd learned from online tutorials during her isolation. As we ate, she outlined her plans for the trial. She would testify, she said, but she'd also ensure her research reached the right people. The other families deserved justice too, even if they couldn't seek it themselves. Her mission had expanded beyond personal vindication to systemic change. The intimidation attempts grew sloppier. Fake social media profiles were created with obvious tells. Threatening messages arrived with traceable IP addresses. The watchers outside our house became careless, sometimes falling asleep in their cars. Blackwood's carefully orchestrated campaign was fraying at the edges. Desperation was making him reckless. Sophie documented every mistake, every traceable threat, every identifiable watcher. Her files grew thick with evidence of witness tampering and harassment. She'd become an expert in chain of custody, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly preserved and documented. The student had surpassed the teacher in thoroughness. 2 weeks before the trial, Sophie made a decision that surprised me. She wanted to return to school for a few hours each week, not full-time, but enough to reconnect with her life. She missed her friends, her favorite teachers, the normalcy of academic routine. Hiding had given her time to heal and prepare, but she was ready to reclaim her space in the world. Her first day back was carefully orchestrated. I drove her to school, watching for tails. Mrs. Chen happened to be walking her dog near the entrance. Mr. Rodriguez was trimming his hedge with a clear view of the parking lot. Sophie had built her own security network without my realizing it. She walked into school with her head high, surrounded by invisible protection. The day passed without major incident, though Sophie reported feeling watched. Some students whispered when she passed. Others offered quiet support. Her AP chemistry teacher welcomed her back warmly, providing catch-up materials she'd prepared specially. Sophie's world was slowly expanding again, pushing back against the constraints Blackwood had tried to impose. That evening, we received word that 2 more families had agreed to provide statements for the trial. Sophie's research had given them courage to speak up. The prosecutor was building a stronger case thanks to her work. What had started as one girl's story was becoming a pattern of predation that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Blackwood responded with a final, desperate gambit. A website appeared overnight, professionally designed and SEO optimized. It portrayed him as a victim of false accusations, complete with testimonials from satisfied parents and successful students. Sophie's name wasn't mentioned directly, but the implications were clear. The site painted a picture of a troubled military family targeting an innocent educator. Sophie studied the website with clinical detachment, taking screenshots of everything. She identified stock photos used for fake testimonials, traced the domain registration to a shell company, and found coding errors that revealed the site's hasty construction. Within hours, she'd compiled a comprehensive report debunking every claim. Her analytical skills had become weapons in their own right. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. A young woman appeared at our door, nervous but determined. She'd been Blackwood's student 5 years ago, she explained. She'd seen the website and recognized the pattern of lies. She'd never reported what happened to her, but she couldn't stay silent watching him do it again. Sophie hugged her, two survivors recognizing each other's courage. Together, they spent the afternoon comparing experiences, finding parallels in Blackwood's methods. He had a playbook, they realized, refined over years of practice, but understanding his patterns made them predictable. Sophie added the new information to her database, the picture becoming clearer with each testimony. The predator's methods were being decoded by his former prey. My military training had taught me about intelligence gathering, but Sophie was teaching me about resilience. She'd turned her trauma into expertise, her fear into determination. Every attack from Blackwood's camp was met with documentation and analysis. She'd become a scholar of survival, writing her thesis in real time. The surveillance around our house intensified as the trial approached. Multiple cars now rotated through our neighborhood. Strange faces appeared at community events, asking casual questions about our family. The mailbox was repeatedly vandalized. Our trash was regularly searched, bags torn open and contents scattered. The desperation was palpable. Sophie responded by organizing neighborhood watches with other military families. They understood operational security and weren't intimidated by civilian stalkers. Soon, every strange car was photographed, every unfamiliar face documented. Blackwood's network found themselves under surveillance by people who knew how to do it properly. The hunters were becoming the hunted. 3 days before the trial, Sophie completed her comprehensive report. Over 100 pages of documentation, cross-referenced and verified. She'd identified 7 victims across a decade, tracked patterns of behavior, documented the harassment campaign, and built a case that any prosecutor would envy. She printed multiple copies, storing them in different locations. Her work would survive regardless of the trial's outcome. That night, as we prepared for the coming testimony, Sophie showed me one final document. She'd written a letter to her future self, describing not what had been done to her, but what she'd done in response. How she'd fought back with intelligence and determination. How she'd found strength in seeking justice for others. How she'd refused to let trauma define her limits. The letter was her real victory, written before the trial's outcome was known. I realized then that Blackwood had already lost. He'd tried to silence a shy girl with a stutter. Instead, he'd created a formidable young woman who dismantled his carefully constructed facade piece by piece. Sophie had turned his own methods against him, documenting and analyzing until his patterns were laid bare. Tomorrow would bring the trial, but tonight, we'd already won the war he'd started. The security cameras showed the silver sedan pulling away just after midnight, not to return. The watchers were abandoning their posts. Blackwood's network was collapsing as the trial loomed. Sophie noticed it too, marking the final entries in her surveillance log with satisfaction. The siege was lifting, but her vigilance would continue. She'd learned that safety came from awareness, not ignorance. As dawn approached on the day before the trial, Sophie and I sat at the kitchen table one last time, reviewing her notes. Her testimony would be clear, precise, and supported by months of documentation. But more than that, it would represent all the girls who couldn't speak for themselves. She'd found her voice not just for her own story, but for theirs as well. The shy girl with the stutter had become an advocate with unshakable purpose. The morning of the trial arrived with an unexpected twist. Sophie woke me at 4 a.m., fully dressed and holding a manila folder. She'd received a text from the young woman who'd visited us, the former student from 5 years ago. The woman had found something in her old emails that Sophie needed to see immediately. We met at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The woman, Catherine, slid a printed email across the table. It was from Blackwood to her parents, dated shortly after she'd stopped tutoring with him. The email expressed concern about Catherine's emotional instability and suggested she might make false accusations due to academic pressure. The preemptive strike was dated 2 days before Catherine had tried to tell her parents what happened. Sophie photographed the email with steady hands, adding it to her digital files. Catherine had brought more evidence, screenshots of similar emails sent to other parents, always right before a student left his tutoring. The pattern was clear. Blackwood didn't just prey on students. He systematically destroyed their credibility before they could speak up. Back home, Sophie cross-referenced the emails with her timeline. Every student who'd left Blackwood's tutoring had received this treatment. Parents had been primed to dismiss any complaints as academic stress or teenage drama. The manipulation ran deeper than we'd imagined. The prosecutor called an hour later. Blackwood's legal team had filed multiple motions to dismiss, claiming prosecutorial misconduct and bias. They wanted Sophie's testimony thrown out based on her documented mental health issues, referencing the anxiety medication prescription that had somehow become public knowledge. The hearing would happen before the trial even began. Sophie listened to my side of the conversation, her jaw set with determination. When I hung up, she was already at her laptop, pulling up her comprehensive report. She began highlighting sections, preparing a counter-narrative that would expose Blackwood's systematic approach to discrediting victims. We arrived at the courthouse early, Sophie carrying her documentation in a weatherproof case. The building felt imposing, but Sophie walked through the metal detectors with her chin up. In the hallway outside the courtroom, we saw other families. Some I recognized from Sophie's research. Parents with daughters who'd been Blackwood students years ago. One mother approached us hesitantly. Her daughter had refused to come, she explained, but she'd brought a notarized statement. Another family had driven 3 hours to be present, though their daughter was now in college and trying to forget. Sophie spoke with each family, taking notes, building connections. Her network of survivors was becoming real, tangible, powerful. Blackwood arrived with 3 lawyers, his confidence seemingly restored. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself like a wronged professional. His eyes swept the hallway, pausing when he saw the gathered families. For just a moment, his mask slipped. Then he smiled and entered the courtroom. The preliminary hearing was brutal. Blackwood's lawyers attacked Sophie's credibility from every angle. They presented her anxiety medication, her time away from school, the restraining order as evidence of an unstable teenager lashing out at a dedicated educator. They even suggested I'd coached her, using my military background to create a convincing but false narrative. Sophie sat beside me, taking notes throughout their presentation. Her hand was steady, her breathing calm. When they presented a photo of her at therapy, illegally obtained but admissible in the hearing, she simply added it to her documentation file. Every attack became evidence of their desperation. During a recess, Sophie showed me what she'd been writing. She'd mapped out Blackwood's legal strategy, identifying patterns from his previous victims. He always attacked their mental health, always suggested parental influence, always painted himself as the concerned educator. The playbook was consistent across years of cases that had never made it to trial. The prosecutor used Sophie's analysis in the afternoon session. Armed with her research, he systematically dismantled Blackwood's defensive strategy. He showed how the same tactics had been used against multiple students, how the timing of Blackwood's concern emails always preceded complaints, how his legal team's attacks followed a predictable pattern. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, began asking her own questions. She wanted to see Sophie's documentation. As Sophie presented her evidence, organized, cross-referenced, meticulously maintained, the courtroom grew quiet. Even Blackwood's lawyers stopped their constant note-taking to watch. Sophie explained her methodology with scientific precision. She'd tracked patterns, verified claims, created timelines. Her stutter was completely absent as she walked the judge through years of Blackwood's predatory behavior. She presented not as a victim, but as a researcher who'd happened to study her own case. The judge called another recess. In the hallway, families who'd been silent for years began talking to each other. Mothers compared notes about emails they'd received. Fathers discussed the intimidation tactics they'd faced. Sophie had given them a framework to understand what had happened to their daughters. Catherine arrived during the recess, bringing 2 other former students with her. They'd been following the hearing online and decided they couldn't stay silent. One was now a medical student, the other a teacher. Both had stories that matched Sophie's pattern analysis perfectly. When court resumed, the judge denied all of Blackwood's motions. More importantly, she ordered his legal team to cease their harassment campaign immediately. Any further intimidation tactics would result in criminal charges. She specifically mentioned the surveillance, the vandalism, the cyber harassment. All the things we'd reported but couldn't definitively prove were connected to Blackwood. Blackwood's lead lawyer requested a conference with the prosecutor. They huddled in the corner, voices low but body language tense. Sophie watched them carefully, reading their expressions. She pulled out her phone and showed me a message from another family. They were driving in from 2 states away, arriving tomorrow for the trial. The conference ended with Blackwood looking pale. His lawyers were arguing among themselves, their confident facade cracking. The prosecutor returned to our table with a carefully neutral expression, but I caught the slight upturn of his mouth. That evening, Sophie organized a meeting at our house for all the families who'd come forward. Our living room filled with parents and young women who'd carried silence for too long. Sophie had prepared information packets for everyone, resources for healing, legal options, support networks. She'd transformed our home into a command center for collective action. The women shared their stories in ways they never had before. Sophie's framework had given them language for their experiences. They recognized Blackwood's tactics, saw through his manipulations, understood how he'd isolated and silenced them. The meeting ran past midnight, bonds forming that would last long after the trial ended. The next morning brought a development none of us expected. Blackwood's educational foundation had withdrawn their support. The family's collective presence, Sophie's documentation, and the judge's ruling had spooked his financial backers. His legal team was reduced to a single lawyer. The others had quietly withdrawn from the case. Sophie received messages throughout the day from students we hadn't found in her research. Word was spreading through private networks, survivors reaching out to each other. Her website traffic spiked as people searched for information about Blackwood. The story was staying local, no media circus. But within our community and others where Blackwood had worked, the truth was spreading. At the courthouse for day 1 of the actual trial, the gallery was packed. Families filled every seat, a silent show of support that spoke louder than any protest. Blackwood sat alone at the defense table, his remaining lawyer looking overwhelmed. The community he'd manipulated for years had turned their backs on him. Sophie testified for 3 hours. She presented her evidence with the same scientific approach she'd shown the judge, but this time she also spoke about the personal impact. She described the fear, the isolation, the systematic destruction of her credibility. Her voice never wavered, her stutter completely absent. She'd found power in truth-telling. The other women testified too, each adding their piece to the pattern Sophie had identified. The medical student explained how Blackwood's abuse had nearly derailed her career. The teacher described years of therapy to overcome what he'd done. Catherine spoke about the email campaigns designed to silence her before she could speak up. Blackwood's defense crumbled. His lawyer tried to suggest conspiracy, claiming the families had coordinated their stories, but Sophie's documentation showed the opposite. These patterns existed before any of them had spoken to each other. The consistency came from Blackwood's behavior, not from collaboration. During a break, I overheard 2 jurors in the hallway discussing Sophie's evidence presentation. They were impressed by her methodical approach, her transformation of trauma into data. One mentioned having a daughter the same age, the fear that someone like Blackwood could operate for so long without consequence. The prosecutor presented Sophie's full report as evidence. All 100 pages entered into the record. Her research would become part of the permanent legal documentation, a resource for future cases. Sophie had created something larger than just her own justice. She'd built a blueprint for exposing predators who operated through reputation and intimidation. On the final day of testimony, Blackwood took a stand. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by desperate attempts to salvage his reputation. I love how Sophie basically turned into a science teacher presenting her research project, except instead of volcano experiments, it's how to document a creep 101, and the whole courtroom is taking notes. But every excuse he offered had been anticipated in Sophie's analysis. She'd predicted his defenses, documented counter-evidence, prepared for every possible manipulation. He was playing by a playbook she'd already decoded. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. As the verdict was read, Sophie reached for my hand. Around us, families who'd waited years for this moment wept quietly. Justice had come not through dramatic confrontation, but through meticulous documentation and collective courage. Blackwood was remanded immediately, his bail revoked due to the documented harassment campaign. As court officers led him away, he looked back at the gallery full of families he'd terrorized. His empire of fear had collapsed, brought down by a shy girl who'd refused to stay silent. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered on the steps. No media cameras captured the moment. This wasn't that kind of story. Just a group of survivors and their loved ones, finally free from the shadow of a predator. Sophie stood in the center, surrounded by the women she'd helped find their voices. The next weeks brought a strange kind of normal. Sophie returned to school full-time. Her transcript issues mysteriously resolved once Blackwood's influence evaporated. The surveillance cars disappeared. The harassment stopped. Our neighbors began waving again, some offering quiet apologies for their distance during the ordeal. Sophie's SAT prep resumed with a new tutor, a retired teacher recommended by 3 different families. Their sessions happened in our living room, door always open. Sophie's scores improved dramatically, without the weight of fear holding her back. Her stutter appeared occasionally, but no longer controlled her voice. The families stayed in touch through a private online group Sophie administered. They shared resources, celebrated milestones, supported each other through difficult days. What had started as Blackwood's attempt to silence one girl had created a permanent support network for survivors. Sophie received acceptance letters from several colleges, each one a victory over Blackwood's attempts to derail her future. She chose a school with a strong pre-law program, inspired by her experience to help others navigate the justice system. Her application essay about transforming trauma into systematic change had impressed admissions committees. At her graduation, I watched my daughter walk across the stage with confident strides, no trace of the terrified girl who'd come home shaking from a tutoring session. She'd transformed herself through intelligence and determination, turning Blackwood's weapons against him. Her diploma represented more than academic achievement. It was proof that predators don't get to write their victims' endings. The young women Blackwood had targeted went on with their lives. The medical student graduated with honors. The teacher started a support group at her school. Catherine entered law school, inspired by Sophie's methodical approach to justice. Each success was a repudiation of Blackwood's attempts to destroy their futures. Sophie spent the summer before college updating her website, creating resources for other survivors. She documented the tactics predators used to silence victims, the patterns of institutional protection, the ways communities could respond. Her work would help others long after our personal ordeal ended. On her last night before leaving for college, Sophie and I sat in the backyard where she'd once practiced testimony to garden gnomes. The security cameras she'd installed were still there, but now they felt like symbols of empowerment rather than fear. She'd learned to protect herself through knowledge and community, not just locks and surveillance. As we packed her things for the dorm, I found her old notebook, the one where she'd first started documenting Blackwood's behavior. The shaky handwriting of those early entries had evolved into confident analysis. She'd kept it as a reminder of how far she'd come, from victim to researcher to advocate. The drive to college was bittersweet. My little girl was leaving, but she was leaving as a warrior. She'd faced down a predator and won, not through violence or revenge, but through intelligence and courage. The shy girl with the stutter had become a young woman who could stand before a courtroom and speak truth to power. At the dorm, as we unloaded boxes, another freshman recognized Sophie from the trial coverage in local papers. The girl approached hesitantly, then whispered her own story of a teacher who'd made her uncomfortable. Sophie listened with the same steady presence she'd shown throughout our ordeal, then offered to connect her with resources. Even here, starting fresh, she couldn't stop being an advocate. That night, driving home alone, I thought about Blackwood in his cell. He'd wanted to destroy my daughter, to silence her like he'd silenced others. Instead, he'd created his own downfall. Sophie had turned his predation into data, his intimidation into evidence, his network of fear into a coalition of survivors. He'd taught her to be thorough, and she'd used that lesson to dismantle everything he'd built. Back home, the house felt empty, but not sad. Sophie's room was neat, ready for holiday visits. Her security system still monitored our property, a gift of protection she'd left behind. On her desk sat a printed copy of her final report, bound and professional. Inside the front cover, she'd written, "For all the girls who were told to keep secrets." Life settled into new rhythms. Work returned to normal without anonymous complaints and investigations. The neighbors became friendly again, some even asking about Sophie's college adventures. The silver sedan never returned. Blackwood's network had dissolved completely, its members distancing themselves from his crimes. Sophie called every week, sharing stories of classes and new friends. She joined a campus advocacy group, using her experience to help other students navigate reporting procedures. Her professors praised her analytical skills, not knowing they'd been forged in the crucible of survival. She was building a future on the foundation of her own strength. 6 months later, I received a letter from one of the families we'd met during the trial. Their daughter had finally felt ready to pursue charges against a different predator, inspired by Sophie's methodical approach. They'd used Sophie's template for documentation, her strategies for building evidence. The ripple effects of her courage continued spreading. Sophie came home for winter break transformed again, no longer the girl seeking justice, but a young woman who'd found it and moved forward. She spoke about her classes with enthusiasm, her career plans with determination. Blackwood was part of her story, but no longer defined it. She'd written her own ending, one where survivors become thrivers. During her visit, we attended a community meeting about improving student safety. Sophie presented her research to school board members, offering concrete suggestions for protecting vulnerable students. Her voice was clear and confident as she explained how predators operate and how institutions could respond. The board voted to implement her recommendations. As spring arrived, I sometimes stood in the backyard where everything had started. The security cameras Sophie installed still functioned, but I rarely checked them anymore. The threats were gone, replaced by the ordinary challenges of life. Our family had survived Blackwood's war and emerged stronger. Sophie's website traffic grew steadily as more survivors found her resources. She updated it between classes, adding new research and support tools. Universities began citing her work in studies about institutional responses to abuse. What started as one girl's refusal to stay silent had become a resource for systemic change. The families from the trial stayed connected, celebrating victories and supporting struggles. Graduations, new jobs, marriages, life events that Blackwood had tried to steal were reclaimed. Sophie had given them more than justice. She'd given them community. They weren't isolated victims anymore, but connected survivors. On the anniversary of Blackwood's conviction, Sophie called with news. She'd been selected for a prestigious internship with a victim advocacy organization. They'd been impressed by her website and her systematic approach to documenting abuse patterns. Her trauma had become expertise that would help others navigate similar battles. I thought about the terrified girl who'd come home that day, unable to speak through her stutter. That girl was gone, replaced by a young woman who'd transformed fear into power. Sophie had won, not by playing Blackwood's game, but by changing the rules entirely. She'd turned documentation into resistance, analysis into advocacy, survival into strength. As I looked at her old SAT prep books still on the shelf, I realized they represented more than academic preparation. They marked the beginning of Sophie's real education, learning to fight back with intelligence, to build coalitions from isolation, to transform victimhood into victory. Blackwood had created his own destroyer, teaching her the very skills she'd used to bring him down. The story that began with shaking hands and stuttered words had become one of methodical justice and collective courage. Sophie had refused to be silenced, and in speaking her truth, she'd given voice to others. The shy girl was gone, but the advocate she'd become carried forward the best parts of who she'd always been: thorough, determined, and ultimately unstoppable. Thanks for watching my channel, Mini Fable Fever. You are all appreciated. Have an amazing day, and see you all in the next video.